Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning. We will start the meeting in about 1 minute. Would anybody like to do a check on your sound?
Jim Smith, sound check.
Everyone. Good morning.
Good morning. Sounds good.
Morning, everyone from Great Snyder County.
Good.
Good morning from Blair County.
Good morning from Philadelphia.
Fox.
All right.
Good morning from Allegheny.
Good morning.
Good morning, Pat Christmas here from Philly.
Okay. Does anybody else hear an echo? Good.
Good morning from Lawrence County.
Good morning, Kathy Lozada from Philadelphia.
Good morning, Ken Lawrence from Montgomery County, but I'm actually in Philadelphia.
Good morning, Jim Smith from Berks County. I'm actually in Florida.
Jesse Daniel, Indiana County.
Okay, Yvonne, I think it's safe to get started. Yvonne, you have to unmute.
Oh, I know, it's the story of my life. Anyway, what I started to say was not doing a roll call because you all did it for yourselves and announced where you are. So we can all see each other. So I don't think we have any concerns about that. Not going to just point out Pat Christmas is here, and he is a new dad and is in a very recent dad. So kudos to you for escaping to be able to do a Zoom. And I see Jonathan Marks is here, and given the week he's had, I think it's just kudos that Jonathan showed up. So thanks for that as well. And obviously the rest of you have also had exciting weeks. It's had we thought about this a little further, we might not have picked the week after the election to hold a meeting on election laws, but we're here, and I think we're ready to go. I'm going to start by asking Chairman Lawrence if he has any words of welcome wisdom he wants to share before we launch into this.
Thank you, Yvonne. I know we have an active agenda, so I do want to get into it. I want to congratulate Mr. Christmas, who I spoke to this morning, and he only wanted to talk about agenda items, not the verse. So he is focused in and zeroed in. So congratulations, Pat. I did not know that, or I would have said it this morning.
I figure if his email response says I'm on paternal leave, it's not a secret and I can talk about it. So, excuse me, parental leave. I was like, but yes, so many of us have been where you are. So yeah, congratulations. Okay, so Ken, are you happy? Do you have more you add?
I'm satisfied. I don't know that I'm happy, but I'm prepared to move forward. So let's move forward.
There we go. Okay. All right. I'm going to do a little quick rundown of what we've done with the report before we actually launch into discussion of the proposed recommendations. basically, the report follows the work groups and the topics they addressed. Oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan, you have your hand up?
Yes, I apologize, Yvonne. I may have to leave at a moment's notice. That's a possibility. As you may have heard, we are in court again. And there are some things that are due today. So I just wanted to apologize in advance if I have to leave abruptly. Hopefully that will not be the case, but it's a possibility. So thank you. And I apologize for interrupting your train of thought.
Oh, no, that's fine. I saw you on the news the other night and I'm sitting here saying to my kids, look, I know him. So it was very exciting for me. Anyway, Lisa, do you have your hand up? Yes.
I just wanted to say that I may also have to leave at a moment's notice. And I know that you already mentioned it, and respectfully, I just want to mention that I don't think there's any greater illustration between the disconnect between election officials and and the people that make the laws than this meeting being before certification on the eve of a recount, right? But I'm going to stay on as long as I can. And thank you very much. And thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, yes, we're going to think about our timing a little better in the future. So I appreciate everybody being able to at least show up for as long as you can. But yeah, so we basically tried to go through what the work groups had done in each individual chapter of the report. Is basically a summary of the research the work groups had done and presented as a whole, with one exception being absentee and mail-in ballots. We had 2 work groups that worked very hard on that, and that work has not gone, that work has not been neglected. We are basically on hold to see what the McGlinko decision is on the constitutionality of the mail-in ballots. That opinion is expected any day now. And our goal is, we've done a lot of writing on the mail-in ballot. So our goal is to, as soon as we have a decision on that, organize a meeting, hopefully over the summer, that we can review just the absentee and mail-in ballot issues and come up with a supplemental report that we can release in the fall, early fall, hopefully, that will have some proposed amendments that, assuming mail-in ballots survive, that would help try to clean up some of the issues we're still having with mail-in ballots right now coming out of this primary. So that's where your work didn't disappear. Grant has done a huge amount of writing in that regard. And so we're ready to pull the trigger once we're comfortable that we have a final decision from the PA Supremes. The other thing is Glenn and I were asked to testify before the House State Government Committee in early May about this group and what we were working on. And during that hour and a half, 2 hours of testimony, we were asked about a couple of topics that we really haven't examined yet. And so the final chapter that says future topics for consideration, what are some research staff did to respond to some of the questions that came from the members of that committee. And we've explained that in that chapter. And then also some things that we're working on moving forward that we want to have on our agenda for next fiscal year's consideration by us. So some of them were topics that I really would not have been my first choices to get into, which includes election audits and prosecutions for voter fraud, but we were asked about it, so we did a little homework on it. We presented that in that final chapter. So that, and I hope I've identified it clearly enough that chapter is the work of staff in response to those questions from legislators and not necessarily the thoughts or opinions of the ELAB as a whole. Russ, you were at that hearing. If I presented what we did accurately?
Yes, ma'am, you have.
Okay, cool. Okay, so having said all that, let's get into the deep dive. And I kind of put these things in the order they are because overall, I think the most difficult issue is the last one. And I want to be able to spend as much time as we can, but I don't want to get bogged down in voter ID before we deal with some of these hopefully lower hanging fruit. So the first recommendation is about voter list maintenance. And what we did was draft legislation that would allow the Department of State to permanently join ERIC or use other similar nationwide databases, and also then with determining, cleaning up lists for deceased voters, we included the language that would allow use of the ERIC death records and United States master death file indexes to verify those voters that should be purged from the rolls. So having said that, I guess the question is, what do you guys think? How do you like it? And what do you want to do with it? So does it suit? What doesn't suit? Is there language in it you don't like? Because ultimately, I want to have up or down votes on these recommendations so that when we leave here within a couple of weeks, we can get this finalized, formatted, and released and start moving on to our next go round with all this stuff. So feel free to speak. And just so you know, in my world, silence is consent. Anything we're doing here. Other areas, no, that's a whole different ball of wax. But when we're deciding on these kind of things. So, Pat, you lit up.
Well, I went off mute, and actually, if it's okay, Jonathan, I was going to ask if you have any thoughts on this. I mean, you being at the department and being having a role on how this would be administered. Did you have any initial reactions to the language? That's okay to put to you. Oh, still on mute.
Sorry, Pat. I think the language is okay, and the report does note that we have House Bill 2507 out there that addresses the deceased voter issue, and I know that that legislation, they received feedback from county CCAP as well as the department. So I think we're comfortable with the form of that legislation, which I believe passed out of the committee, the House committee, unanimously. You know, I don't think anyone has an objection here to enabling the department explicitly to participate in these, you know, national programs, multi-state programs like ERIC. The only agita I had with the language is that it specifically mentions ERIC, but I think it's clear enough that it would also cover any successor program to ERIC. So I think it's okay as written. That was my initial take.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, I know we discussed in the last meeting and we went back and forth on whether we needed to actually name ERIC, but it seemed appropriate given the context that we're already participating in it. So that would reinforce that that was an acceptable thing to do. But yes, adding other, the intent was to be successor organizations as well. So thank you. Yeah, I think we got that then. All right. Okay, so 15 minutes in, do you want to vote on recommendation number 1? If you're happy, raise your hand physically or your little button or whatever. I have to avoid looking at the staff who are also there. I'm seeing very close to unanimity. So yeah, we're going to say that's been adopted. So we got one thing to put in our report. Yay. So, okay. Item number 2, recommendation number 2 is another kind of low hanging fruit. And we had talked about that before, and that was cleaning up the language regarding formerly incarcerated persons to acknowledge the, now of course I can't remember the case's name, but to acknowledge the holdings of the litigation that said you can't limit it, do that 5-year limitation. So any thoughts on this? It's a fairly lengthy recommendation, but that is because we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss any cross references or other places where that came into be. And I also will say, just a quick aside, we have heard from several of you with some questions about relatively minor corrections, and we appreciate them continuing coming in. And I'm not planning on going over them unless the people who have brought them up specifically say we need to, because I think they're not of major substance to what we were trying to do. It was more a matter of word choice, some typos, that kind of thing. So, but anyway, that little aside, is there any discussion on recommendation number 2? Does anybody have any thoughts on how we should address that? Okay, do we want to vote on this? Oh, Jonathan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, I read the wording and it's very specific to registering to vote and not necessarily voting, and just, putting it out there that, it could be challenged. I was thinking through, like, how could this unravel, in court potentially. It doesn't address somebody who's registered prior to being confined in a penal institution. They're already registered to vote. They're on the voter registration rolls. They're confined in penal institution during that time period, during which they're not entitled to vote. If they're convicted of a felony, there are exceptions, of course. One are people who are not convicted of felonies, but they're confined in, say, a county prison on a misdemeanor. So I just wanted to note, because it's very specific to, it's barring them from registering to vote, but it doesn't really address the act of voting. It addresses very narrowly the act of registering to vote. So I don't know if that's something that perhaps at a later date we should address the voting piece of that. Is I see a potential argument being made that someone who is already registered prior to being incarcerated is not necessarily going to be removed from the registration rolls. They will just be unable to vote for that period of time they're confined in a penal institution. I don't know if any of this is making sense, Yvonne, but
No,
it's a
absolutely.
complicated history on this item. So
well, and in the in the narrative portions of the report, we did try to talk about how Department of State identifies those people who have had their voting rights
Right.
suspended. I guess is the best way to put it. So we did try to address that in the narrative. I think there's no reason why we can't circle back to that moving forward and talking about the impact on people actually voting.
Right.
I think this could be, because again, we can recommend it. Nobody may take it up until we get around to talking about the voting part of it. Anyway, I mean, this is one of the
Right.
plus minuses of being an advisory board to the General Assembly. We can recommend all kinds of things that we think are great ideas. Whether anybody will take them up, introduce them, and shepherd them through the process is another story. And even if they do, it can be a lengthy process. It can take multiple years sometimes. I mean, we've had stuff that we've proposed with other advisory boards that have taken 10 years to be enacted. So I think the perspective, I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds that, and that's something too. And there's no reason if somebody were to introduce this the way it is, there would be no reason on earth why Department of State couldn't go to a hearing or whatever and say, hey, we like this, but don't forget about this. And, people could propose amendments to it that would move it forward. So I think as a bare bones, cleaning that up, I think we're okay. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And the narrative was great. And when I initially read the actual proposed language, I read it in the context of the narrative. And then I thought about it again. I'm like, well, let me read this and completely divorce it from the narrative. And I'm like, okay, this could mean something else, depending on what side of the argument you're on. So I only noted it for that purpose, but the narrative was excellent in explaining, as well as you can explain a complicated history. It was very good.
Well, thank you. I wrote that, but
great job, Yvonne.
One of the other things to remember, and one of the pluses of being an advisory board like this, is the narrative can be used as part of the statutory construction. If that provision would go to court, they could look at the narrative for legislative intent, because our reports are the kind of thing that could be. So that would be, I think, one of the arguments is, yeah, old on its face, this is what it says, but here, look at the report and read it in context with the narrative. And so that's one of the nicer aspects of being able to work from this kind of perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have thoughts they want to share? Andy.
Just dovetailing kind of on what Jonathan said, in the statement that's going to be provided to agencies, that is where it discusses the requirement to post notice that you are not qualified to vote. So in the statement, it does say not qualified to vote. And I just noticed that there's a typo in there.
Okay.
You are not qualified to vote should be if it's on page 11 in the underlined section. But again, to Jonathan's point, the narrative, the statement that's provided seems to suggest definitely what the intent is behind it with regard to voting as well as registration, and that maybe those should be made to match. I agree.
Russ.
Yes, Yvonne, I just wanted to add that down the road, if we do actually introduce this as legislation, there may be an opportunity to include some of the narrative as a statement of legislative intent within the bill itself, which would help to establish what you were talking about with Jonathan.
Cool. Yeah, I always forget about legislative intent in statutes. It's a double-edged sword, but in this case, I think it would help us. Randall.
I think anything we can do to make it clear what the limitations of this recommendation are, should someone want to snag it and copy and paste it into a piece of legislation, would be helpful. I don't know that we necessarily need to hash it out, but we should at least add a disclaimer to it that this, that additional language should potentially be added to deal with those who are registered before becoming a felon. So that we have that disclaimer there, but otherwise I have no problem with it as long as we note clearly what the limitations are on the recommendation.
Okay. And I think I would put that in the recommendation itself. I wouldn't put it back in the narrative. I would put it right up front in as part of the recommendation itself so that people don't miss it. Because believe it or not everybody reads these reports cover to cover. I mean, it's astonishing. I think, they should take it to bed with them and study it. And, but not everybody does that. So the wounds to my ego are huge, but I always survive it. But anyway, okay, I think that makes sense. I think that works. Anybody have anything else they want to add to that? Okay, so then let's have a vote on recommendation number 2 with that disclaimer added about the already registered people. Hands? I'm calling that a victory. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Actually, I'm looking at the order I taught these in, and I'm going to skip ahead to number 4, election official and poll worker training. And I think, oh, Amy, sorry. Okay. I hate the way people pop around on the screen and then I can't see them. Okay, no hands are up. Okay. The election official and poll worker training, I think our conversation at our last meeting essentially was, yes, guidance is needed. No, we are not the people to write that guidance, that's really something that should be done between the counties and the Department of State. As an organization, generally, we don't write regulations. That's an executive function. And even if we propose that regulations be changed, we do it in general terms. We don't actually write recommendations. We will regulations. We will say, you need to write regulations on this, and it should probably cover X, Y, and Z, but we don't get into huge specifics. So I think what we said is there does need to be guidance. CCAP and Department of State should figure it out, and made some general comments about how it shouldn't be one size fits all, and it needs to take into account the variations between the counties. And we also tried to lay out a few suggested topics that might be amenable to that kind of semi-uniform guidance. So with respect to that, I mean, there's no official legislative proposal to approve, but if, but I'd like to get a vote, a discussion and a vote on the general concept of us saying this is how we think it should be dealt with. So again, anybody have anything they want to share?
Yvonne, I guess I'll ask. Oh, actually, Joe, here, let me give you first. Hand went up.
Sure. Well, congratulations, Pat, by the way. I guess I'll speak first on this because I know part of the idea of this came out of some testimony that I'd given, I believe, in front of the Senate a couple years ago. You know, while I believe that it is important that we have somewhat standardized training to cover the basics for both election workers in the county and poll workers. Through the discussions that we had in the breakout meetings, I also feel that it's very important to have that flexibility for each county, because every county is a little different. But we have some general guidelines, and we had at one point talked about certifications and things of that nature. That gets into a whole nother aspect of this that we kind of discussed our way through and said, yeah, that's probably not the right way to go with this. We're nowhere near that point yet, at the very least. So I'm supportive of this language the way it's written. I think that it encompasses all of the discussions that we had in the meetings that were on this topic.
Thanks, Joe. Pat.
Yeah, I guess I just have a question to put out there. Would it make any sense to include the election director association? So I know the election directors work very, very closely and with both CCAP and the department, but would it be worth naming those entities as well in the rec? And I put that out to the folks who have been a part of CCAP and the department and the associations.
County people, I know we have several of you. Most of you are, well, maybe half of you. But anyway, county people, what do you think about that? Should we add that as well? Bruce.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should add that. The elections directors can be extremely helpful. And I think the way the recommendation is written is great because it notes the great diversity among the 67 counties. And as Joe noted, that's where we have to have that kind of flexibility in where there should be some standard things and some things that need to be customized, for lack of a better word.
Okay, Ken.
I would agree absolutely to add election directors to
Okay.
the recommendation.
And did I see your hand, Jonathan, but I thought I saw Thomas's up before you. Are you okay? Yeah.
That's actually just a thumbs up. I agree.
Oh, okay. Lisa.
I also disagree.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Okay, then, oh, Dan.
Thank you, Yvonne. I think it's a very worthy suggestion, and I would concur with it. Thank you.
Perfect. It's always fun trying to take what you hear in meetings and conversations and distill it into something that everybody can agree on. So feeling good this morning so far. So all right, so then let's vote on this recommendation with that addition for the election directors. Everybody happy with that?
Well, Yvonne, I think if it's okay, Kathy, I think that you still have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I also agree. No,
Okay,
that's okay.
thank you.
That's okay. That's okay. I just also, I also agree, but I also want to recognize that not only are things different in different counties, but sometimes even on the ground, right? Even wards have different processes. And so I think that it's important that there is some type of training that is consistent and that it's actually mandatory.
Cool. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Even in my little town, the differences between precincts and wards and how they do things are, they're not necessarily huge differences, but they are not always consistent. So, okay. All right. So hands up if you like it with the addition of the election directors. Okay. Most everybody is on that one as well. So, okay. Thank you. All right, I included the pre-canvassing just because nothing's happened with it yet. So that's just basically a reminder. At recommendation number 5, I don't think we need to do anything with it because we voted on it a year ago. So that brings us back to recommendation number 3, which is on voter identification. So I want to break this up into pieces, because I think we're likely to have a fair amount of discussion depending on the level we're looking at. with this piece. So I think the first thing I would like everybody to discuss and vote on is approving that we take out the language that Applewhite said was unconstitutional. There's no reason to allow unconstitutional language to stay in the statute when the case is finally resolved. I guess the first question is there any objection to us cleaning up the Applewhite provisions? Okay. So everybody in favor of doing that and just that? Hands up, please. I always have to skim over the faces of staff as I'm looking to make sure who I'm seeing. But yes, thank you. That is a resounding yes as well. Okay. I'll make myself a note. Okay. And then I think the next question is again a very broad scope question. And what we staff believe we heard at the last meeting was that not all of you, but most of you feel some form of voter identification every time you vote is an acceptable, if not worthy thing to do. Now, the form it takes, what it is, what it looks like, that's our next step. But at this point, I want to just have the discussion that is voter identification at each instance that you vote desirable. And Lisa, you have your hand up?
Yes, I do. Unfortunately, I'm in a car, so I can't actually read the report and to be on the Zoom and drive at the same time. But I just wanted to point out that the very first sentence of this section, it says that the majority of the members feel as though, voter ID, we need voter ID to prevent fraud or something along those lines. There are pieces of this that I certainly am in favor of, but I am not in favor of that first line. And I am not in favor of broad-based voter ID. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I think that we should probably vote on that before we say that the majority of the members are in favor of it.
Well, and that's what I'm hoping to do here, Lisa. So thank you. Ken? That is no, that's my mouse. I'm sorry. I thought you had your hand up, but it's my mouse sitting on the middle of the screen. But Bruce.
Yvonne, perhaps you should read that first sentence so that everyone's on the same page here.
Okay, yes, we wrote that sentence based on what we thought we were hearing from everybody, but we could have overstated what was being said. And it says the majority of the advisory board believes that requiring voter identification for each voter desiring to cast a ballot is a reasonable action to take to prevent voter fraud. Now, I think there are two areas that could be debated. That is using the term majority. If there isn't a majority, even a simple majority, then it's not a recommendation we can make. So I think the use of that term is still appropriate. I think the bigger question is, are we saying voter identification is a reasonable action to prevent voter fraud, or just that it's a reasonable action for elections in general? And Ken, I see, and then Joe, and then Amy.
Yeah, I would take exception to the word fraud. You know, I would be for this, for providing confidence in the elections, but you know, I take exception to the word fraud there in the first sentence.
I could definitely see changing that to provide confidence in election, what did you say, competency?
You know, election integrity, confidence in the election, something.
Yeah, election integrity, I think, does sound nicer than preventing voter fraud. Voter fraud is kind of pejorative. You're right. Okay, so then we had, who was next? Joe, Amy, Dan, Jonathan, Jim. That's the order you're on my screen. So
Yvonne, just for clarification, I think one of the ways that I'm assuming here that the staff may have come up with the wording with the majority was probably based upon the reactions of the subcommittee meetings that we had. I know not everybody was a part of them, but the vast majority of those meetings were in favor of the way you have it written. So that's my guess, is that's how you got to that language. So not trying to back up the staff here, but I believe that's probably how they came to that conclusion.
okay, thanks, Joe. Amy.
So I can understand the value add of this instilling, you know, election integrity or confidence in our electoral process, because this has been such a hot button issue. However, I do still firmly believe that this is a solution in search of a problem, and it's going to be another major procedural change that we are now adding to the counties to administer on top of a process that we still have not fixed. So we're adding a procedural change, and we're talking about, you know, decades of training poll workers not to ask for ID. So it sounds like it's going to be a simple process to implement, but it's not. So for those reasons, I don't think that this is something that we should include in the report.
Dan.
Thank you, Yvonne. I was going to offer that if the words voter fraud remain in the first sentence, I'd like to suggest that the word prior to that, which is prevent, I'd like the group to consider perhaps eliminating that word and instead saying reduce the potential for voter fraud. You know, there is a listing in the back of the document that you submitted to us of individuals in the past who have at least perhaps attempted voter fraud. Now, given the population of Pennsylvania, it's not that big of a list, but that list does exist. There are people who have tried to cheat. And I think by using the word prevent, it makes it sound as though, well, if we do this, then it'll all go away, that voter fraud will be totally prevented. And I think I would offer that it might be safer to say reduce the potential for. That's assuming the group wishes to continue with those two words, voter fraud. Thank you.
Jonathan.
No, I was just, you know, my comment was sort of the language, the summary language is pretty broad. It talks about voter ID broadly, but what's proposed is much more narrow. We're talking, you know, we have voter ID for in-person voting, and that the scope of that is it applies to first-time voters. People are voting for the first time in their election precinct. What's being proposed is that every voter, every time they vote, is going to have to show ID. So I think, you know, I'm just noting that that sentence doesn't really capture all of those thoughts. Again, I think the narrative and the history is clear enough about the discussion. But it doesn't define what the the scope is. There are those that believe the first time voter ID requirements are adequate. And then there are those that believe that they're not, and that everyone, every time they vote, should provide ID. I'm in the former group. I think our first time voter IDs is adequate. But to the extent that we're going to make people show ID every time they vote, I just don't think that's clear in that summary. And I think that might be part of the problem. Is one, it implies that we don't already have ID requirements, and two, it doesn't really define what people were agreeing to, and what they're agreeing to. If you read the proposed language, is a ID requirement every single time you vote, no matter how many years you vote in the same precinct.
Okay, that if we get to that point, that actually, I see that as a relatively simple fix that I can just clarify that introductory language, get a little more specific about what we're doing. So assuming we want to move forward with this, I think that's a fix we can make pretty easily. But thank you, Jonathan. Jim.
Yvonne, I just wanted to simply, state my support for the chairman's recommended change to the language. I think, and I can agree that use of the word "to prevent voter fraud" is a slightly charged phrase, and I think that we can all agree that we are here for the purpose of ensuring that the integrity of the election is our goal. So I think that removing the words "action to take to prevent voter fraud" and replacing with "action to take to ensure the integrity of the election or election integrity," something like that would be preferable. And so I thank the chairman for that recommendation and support it wholeheartedly. Thanks.
Yes, thank you as well. I appreciate that too. All right, so anyone else have, Andy.
Yeah, I want to echo, I guess, a couple sentiments, Amy's in particular, about this as a solution in search of a problem. But I think even internally, the wording of this is somewhat, I don't want to say misleading, but confusing. In section 102.1, proof of identification, it references the whenever proof of identification is required, which sort of is the current situation, right, for a first-time voter. But if the intent of this is to say, well, it's going to be required every time, that's just going to be a confusing section, I think. But I'm generally not in support of it at all either. I'm in the camp of,
Not necessary.
Well, yeah, as Commissioner Vogler said, if we can fit all these instances on appendix, we're not talking about something that's a problem that rises to this level, in my view. We certainly haven't had it here. I mean, you're always going to have someone trying something. We've had a lot of instances where people accidentally or through a misunderstanding of the law thought they could vote. My grandmother applied for her mail-in ballot. She died the day after it came. We filled it out for her because we thought that's what she would have wanted, right? We hear that. Is that voter fraud? Well, that vote doesn't count. So these terms about what is fraud and what isn't fraud are to me somewhat charged, and to echo Mr. Smith's comments, unnecessary. So for those reasons, I'm not in favor of the wording of the summary or the substance of the suggestion in general.
Okay, thank you. Joe.
Sorry, get on mute. With respect, I would say this, and this, the implications of fraud, I'm not addressing that with my comments, but I can tell you that in a small rural county, since the pandemic came upon us, we have seen a great number of people moving to our area here in rural Pennsylvania, from more metropolitan areas, even out of state, New Jersey, Delaware, New York, on a regular basis, on a weekly basis. We see people moving here from out of state to come to our way of life. And while I surely appreciate that, it does make it challenging for poll workers who have worked at those polls, many of them all their lives, or for many, many years, who do not know those folks. And obviously, while that first time in the poll is going to be caught with an ID. I can tell you that having worked the polls as a clerk many, many years ago, it takes more than one time to get to know those people by their faces. And for that very reason, I think that it's very important, especially as we talk about some of the changes that we may decide to make with poll worker shifts in splitting shifts. We're already doing that in rural Pennsylvania because we absolutely have to in order to cover those polls. You cannot find a person to sit for 13 hours throughout one day, all 5 people at that poll. You have to sometimes cover shifts with split shifts, and that causes the potential, as we're talking about, for someone trying to vote twice. Does it happen often? No, thankfully not. But we have to make sure that we can prevent that. And so for that very reason, especially, I would say that requiring a voter ID every time someone comes into my rural polls to make sure that we know who they are and that they are an eligible voter is the issue. And I absolutely understand that some people are against that, but you know, I've got to show an ID many, many times throughout the year. And those people should know who I am, but they don't. Or even if they do, they're required. And I think that something as important as this requires that we make sure we have some sort of ID every time. So.
Good. Thank you, Joe. Jonathan?
Yeah, I just I wanted to offer the flip side, and I'm a pragmatist by nature, and I try to take the emotion out of all of these things when I consider them. But this is an issue that became personal for me several years ago. My father had a stroke. He no longer has a driver's license. I think for me, looking at someone like my dad, who's lived at the same address, he's been voting at the same polling place for decades. This would require him now to show ID that he doesn't have. So I think, again, I try to take the emotion out of this, but it's an emotional issue. This is a hot button issue. It always has been. And I guess my argument would be somebody is going to have to show me that this is a significant enough problem to expand it to every voter every time, as opposed to what it is now, which is every voter the first time they're voting in their precinct. And I'll remind folks too that for absentee and mail-in balloting, it is an every time requirement. Every time you apply, you have to provide ID, and that ID has to be verified. So, I think we have a fairly broad, in my opinion, ID requirement in our law right now. Certainly is broad in terms of absentee and mail-in voters, because it includes every single one of them, and first-time voters as well. But it did, I've evolved over the years as I've looked at this because of my own personal experience with my parents, and there are a lot of those folks in Pennsylvania, and I wanted to put that on the record, that there's a flip side to this argument as well, and there are folks now who have been voting for years. They've been going to the same place, and this requirement, as it's proposed, would now put that burden on those individuals as well.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. Russ?
I certainly understand all the arguments against being made here. And, I can empathize with you, Jonathan. Here's the thing, though. I can't think of another segment of life where you're required to show ID, that you're only required to do it the first time. You go to the state store, you have to show the ID again and again and again, because there's a different clerk. You go to the bank to cash a check, you have to show your ID again and again and again, because there's a different teller. The poll book does not know who these people are. An electronic poll book might know who these people are if they were carrying a card that could be swiped and could be recognized by the digital data. But the poll book, as we use it right now in Pennsylvania, does not know who anybody is. And the quickest way, the surest way to make sure that we ensure the integrity of our election system is to make sure that everybody who is showing up to vote at a polling place actually belongs voting at that polling place. It is no more difficult than any other exchange that you make in life that requires ID. And I understand that some people don't drive anymore. Well, guess what? Pennsylvania issues non-driver's license photo ID. And there are other forms of ID that can be used as well. So the notion that it's a burden to do it anything beyond the first time you vote, it just baffles me. It baffles me. So therefore, you know, I'm totally supportive of requiring voter ID in Pennsylvania every time you show up to vote. I do it when I go to the bank. I do it when I go to other exchanges. It's no problem for me to yank that thing out of my wallet. And, you know, IDs are, with the selection of IDs that we would be able to utilize in Pennsylvania, I don't see why this would be such a huge problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Christina.
I disagree, Russ. I think when you talk about quick, the length of time and the lines when you start to add something like voter ID, particularly with a long list of things that could be accepted or could not be accepted, need to really be considered carefully as to how long the lines will be at polling locations once you start to add these provisions and these things. The other thing I really want to stress is that we've been wearing masks in polling locations for the last 2 years. So the idea, as someone said earlier, that you know everyone that comes into your polling place, well, we've had masks on our face, or at least I've had a mask on my face when I go vote, and I don't assume that someone is going to ask me to take down my mask so they can verify who I am. I think that as was it Amy that said earlier, we're making a problem where there is none. And I really think that there are so many other critical aspects of the election law that we really need to focus on right now, that this seems to be something that is charged from a political climate rather than an actual need among the election directors and among those that are on the ground to actually fix. And I would urge, I really think that one wonderful thing that could be done over the summer is that if every legislator were to actually run a mock election and do everything from the back end to the front end to the counting of the mail-in ballots, maybe they would come out of this with a different opinion. But if they're working strictly on the charged media that they hear, it doesn't really seem to be beneficial. That's all I've got to say right now.
Thank you, Christina. Jonathan.
And sorry, I'll go again. And I want to say before I start that I respect Representative Diamond, and I respect that we are able to have these debates, whether they be in a public meeting, a hearing, or on the front steps of the Capitol. But I do want to note that the other things that Representative Diamond was talking about, buying alcohol, they're not constitutionally guaranteed rights. We're talking about the right to vote here. I also wanted to note, just for the record, that ID is not the only fail-safe. A voter can be challenged at the polling place. To my knowledge, you can't challenge whether someone's 21 years of age or not and can purchase the alcohol. There are other things in place, the challenge process being the primary one at the polling place, where a voter, a poll watcher or another voter, or even the polling place officials can challenge the qualifications of the individual who is presenting to vote. So, I just want to make sure it's framed correctly. That's not the only fail-safe. There are other fail-safes, the primary one being the challenge process.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pat.
Yeah, I guess I'll weigh in with a few points and stipulate things that I think are widely known. I mean, that we all know what the public polling shows, right? And I think that's part of the reason why at the last meeting, why we had at least a rough consensus around that we could live with some version of an ID proposal as long as it didn't risk disenfranchising folks. And I think that is obviously a heck of a lot easier said than done. And why we may get to something here at the end of this meeting, we may not. There are a bunch of other states that have a version of a non-strict version of ID, right? We're among like 15 or 16 states that have just the HAVA minimum. So, you know, I think there are other options out there. I have, you know, some minor quibbles with the language. The biggest issue I have with the current proposal, now that we're talking a little bit about substances, the lack of an affidavit safeguard, which incidentally was part of both House Bills 1300 and 1800. And, you know, I guess something else that comes out of this conversation is, and that I'm sure we're thinking, is that most of us here, maybe all of us here, have multiple forms of what's listed, but that's not true for everybody. There are smaller segments of the population that wouldn't have something that's here, or they would have, you know, actually another thing that seemed to be missing was the voter registration card we get issued, right? I mean, that should serve as an appropriate form of ID. That is also a form of ID that I'm sure most people have no idea where it is, or it disappeared pretty soon after they got it. So there's a, yeah, I just want to acknowledge like the real tension here between the number of potential fraud cases that are out there, and they are out there, but it's obviously it's a very, very, very small number, and the risk we would have of tripping people up over these steps. So I guess my overall comment here is I think we can figure something out here as long as there's a long list of photo and non-photo options with an affidavit. But obviously, like, that's going to require a lot more discussions. That's at least where I stand at this point. Thank you.
Once we resolve this discussion, moving forward, whether we agree to do voter ID for everyone or not, the next step is to look at the proposals we've written in the context of what is acceptable voter ID, even if it is only for first-time voters, what that looks like. So that a lot of that substantive stuff we're hopefully going to get to once we resolve where we are here. Ken.
Representative,
You're breaking up.
I think we need to control if we need this or not.
Anybody understand what Ken is saying? No, it's all broken up, Ken.
Ken, you're cutting in and out.
Going on.
Okay, I'll try to.
Okay. Russ, do you want to talk a while Ken works on his computer?
Sure. I just wanted to bring up another constitutional right that you need to show ID to exercise, and that is to purchase a firearm in Pennsylvania. I would also ask, and maybe Jonathan could chime in on this, if somebody would show up under Pennsylvania law now, somebody shows up as a first-time voter at a polling place and does not have ID. It's my understanding that they're not turned away and they can still vote provisional. Is that correct? Because that would be the same thing that it would happen to anybody else who shows up without an ID.
That is correct. That is the remedy for a first-time voter who's not able to present ID.
Okay. I'm going to call on Bruce because Ken, you're still frozen on my screen. You are not moving at all.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, there's no question, I think, as Pat pointed out, polling data and it tells us that the voter ID is something that the public, both parties seem to support strongly. But secondly, I don't think there's anything that's ripping us apart as much as a society right now in terms of election issues than the integrity of the electoral process, which is just a constant topic of discussion, particularly and perhaps more so in rural areas like the area that I'm from. But this voter ID will, in fact, help address that issue, I think, to a large extent and put more confidence in the election system, because right now, frankly, there isn't. With all due respect, you know, a lot of that was caused by actions in the last election, perceived or whether meant or not, that took place. And I think this is one way we have to address it that is not onerous. Certainly the options for voter ID listed can be many. So that's just my point.
Okay, Ken, I just saw your message and I concur with what you just wrote in the chat. I'm going to do a poll here and see a vote here and see where we stand. But if I could ask joint state staff to go dark for a minute, so I can count a little more easily. Grant, would you mind going dark as well, please? Thank you. Okay. All right. So one question only.
Yvonne?
Yeah.
May we do a roll call vote on this?
Sure. I don't see any reason not to. Obviously, I think most of us are here. So, all right, so the question is voter ID for all every time. And a yes vote means yes, you want voter ID every voter, every time they vote. No means the current status quo for this purpose. Dan, you have something?
Yes, thank you. Very brief question in advance of this vote, which obviously we're going to have some people on one side and some people on another. Once that occurs, Yvonne, is it possible to then draft a, for lack of a better term, a majority recommendation and a minority recommendation? Is that a possible next step?
I would not call them a majority and minority recommendation, but we would definitely identify that the issue was discussed and it was, there was a divide, and what the pro people suggested and what the con people suggested. So I have a personal aversion to minority reports.
Well, forgive me for interrupting though. I'm not a legislator, but and that's the group to whom this report is going to be submitted. And I don't mean to put Mr. Diamond on the spot since he's the only elected legislator, I believe, on this group. But I'm wondering if it would be helpful for them to know where this board came down on this issue. I mean, you know, how many of, maybe not by a specific count, but I think it would be helpful to the legislators to know that a certain number took a position and that particular position received more support than the other position, whether you call it majority, minority or not. But I think it needs to be made clear that once the position was taken, and there are two different positions, but I think the legislators might want to know, well, how did the board come down on this? And maybe it goes back to Mr. Diamond's point about a roll call, that it be part of the record. That's just a suggestion.
Yes, you're correct, Dan. That was my intent of asking for a roll call vote on this.
Well, and Dan, I think you and I are different on semantics. It's the, it would be clear, and obviously we would run it by all of you before we finalized it, but it would be clear how the voting went and why the voting went the way it did. And I see Jonathan and then Christina also have raised their hands again.
Thank you, Yvonne. I just wanted to point out that Pat Christmas posted something in the chat, and you know, I think it may be worth discussing for a few minutes, the possibility of a specific work group. And he mentions affidavit, and what he's talking about there specifically is something, you know, that's the big problem with the proposed language, is that it's going to push everyone into, you know, provisional balloting process. And, you know, just thinking back on the history of this, a similar law was already ruled unconstitutional by our Supreme Court. And a large reason for that is because, voters didn't have a simple out that everyone could do in the form of an affidavit. It was a very specific thing where they had to affirm or swear that they were indigent and couldn't obtain ID. That was a burden. And it was also, something that placed a stigma on those voters. They were having to admit essentially that the reason they couldn't provide ID is because they were indigent. So I think it is worth discussing if there are additional changes that can be made to this that would make it more palatable to folks who may generally agree with the idea of voter ID for all voters, but may not agree on the specifics as it's proposed in the current language.
Mhm. Let me think about this. Oh, Randall, your hand's up.
I would probably be a yes for this, except having served as a former election director in a fifth largest county in the state and hearing the individuals who were genuinely going to be at a loss for an ID after years and years of voting back in 2012 when this happened. I will throw out another thing for consideration. The last thing our poll workers need right now is another source of contention in the polling place. Thing one. Thing two, I don't personally see any real harm with the broad list that we use for first-time voters. But the reality of it is, the more different documents our poll workers need to look at, the slower the process is going to be to move them through the polling place. Ultimately, they're going to be the front lines of receiving grief from voters and needing to handle it and deal with these things as they come up. I'm probably I'm probably going to be a no, just based upon what I've seen firsthand previously. If I hadn't spent the voter ID years 2012 and 2013 in the seat as a county election director, I would probably feel differently, but I've had a lot of those firsthand conversations, and there are unintended consequences that will create. The other thing I will throw out is even if we went with the provisional ID requiring each and every time, the reality of it is I still don't think it's going to satisfy those folks. They want to see proof of citizenship ultimately, not even just photo ID. They want to see proof of citizenship from each voter prior to registration and prior to voting, and that we can't do. The National Voter Registration Act, of course, prohibits anything more than the affidavit at the point of registration. But I'm afraid that this, if I believe this would solve the voter confidence issue, I'd be there. I really would. But the list is so broad that we're still going to have people say, nope, that's not good enough. Anyone can get a utility bill. It doesn't mean you're registered to vote. You can get a driver's license. It doesn't mean you're eligible to vote. PennDOT issues driver's licenses to legal aliens who are here, and they have a right to when it's prothonotary naturalized U.S. citizens, almost all of them had a social security number and had a driver's license the day they were naturalized that they were able to use when they, in addition to the naturalization certificate, to apply for a passport. So I'm not sure we're going to accomplish our goal here, and we're going to create more stress and strife for our poll workers to encounter.
Okay, so this is one of the advantages of being an advisory board in the commission. We are not a legislative committee. We, rather than voting on this specific recommendation, because it sounds like there are a lot of, well, yeah, but kind of positions on the proposal, that instead I would propose that we, because again, this is a draft report. that we simply leave the voter identification recommendation out, and that we devote 1 or 2 future. I don't want to do a work group because on this particular topic, because I think everybody's going to want to be on it anyway. So I'm thinking we could move forward with devoting a meeting or 2 simply to voter identification, and really nailing down the issues that are problematic. I would take this particular recommendation and bring it back to us as a whole in the future. And we could go through and talk about what are the acceptable forms, what about affidavits. One of the things Pat pointed out in some comments he sent me earlier is I had written that the ID were in order of priority. To my mind, that was listing them in order of how secure or how likely to be accurate the ID forms were. But as Pat pointed out, how do you have a checklist? Do you go down and you say, do you have this? No. Well, then do you have this? No. That it should be whatever's on the list should be an acceptable ID. So we could just leave the language, the background language that talks about voter identification. Yeah, not completely eliminate, because I want to clean Applewhite out, and everybody says that's fine, but modify this that it just cleans up Applewhite, and obviously send it back to everybody that they approve. But to take it off the table, go back, have this group meet and discuss this and this only, and nail down if we can address everybody's concerns. There are going to be members of the board who say, no voter ID ever, don't do it. And there are going to be members who say voter ID all the time, every time, no discussion. But if that middle group can work towards consensus, maybe we can come up with something that most people can live with, because I do think we're dealing in a reality, public perception, and overall public support for some kind of voter ID. So what I would like to propose is we remove this part of the actual mandatory voter ID stuff from this recommendation and take it back and work on it as a group together at future meetings, and not move forward with this today, because I think we're not going to accomplish what we want to accomplish in 45 minutes to go through and see if there are areas where we can find consensus, that, and maybe we jumped the gun, maybe I jumped the gun on making a proposal on voter ID that I don't think I did. I think it has more. We put in some specifics that we hadn't discussed before, and we're learning during this conversation that those specifics really need tweaking. So that is where I'd like to see us go. We would rewrite recommendation number 4 as simply repealing Applewhite out of the code. And then we would move forward with a meeting or 2 in the future dedicated just to voter identification with the whole group together. We are also planning on having a meeting sooner rather than later that we're going to devote to mail-in ballots, because to the extent they're constitutional and we want to make recommendations to improve some of the problem areas in that, I want to get that done with the possibility that some of those recommendations could even be enacted before the general election in November. So that's where I'd like to go. Anybody feel, I feel uncomfortable forcing a vote on this right now when I think there are a lot of nuances that that won't be represented if we do an up or down vote right now on the issue. Jim.
Mr. Chairman, I'm in support of the idea of tabling this discussion until we can set up another time that's set aside just for the purpose of discussing this topic and postponing a vote today for what it's worth. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jim. Ketsy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I'm totally in support with tabling this. I can see both sides of the issues. We here in Philadelphia have experienced a lot of different activity during election day, right? And so there are times that I feel like we absolutely should require an ID at every election. But I can totally understand the concerns that I'm hearing here today. And the last thing we want to do, especially in my community, is suppress the vote. And so I would appreciate if we do hold this for another time or for further discussion.
Okay. Anyone else? Joe.
Yeah, just real quick, Yvonne. I mean, I actually had highlighted that second line talking about the fact that we want to make sure that no persons are disenfranchised. I mean, I think that should be throughout this entire discussion, no matter where we go with it, that should always be first and foremost. I don't know a single person that wants anyone to be disenfranchised. In fact, we fight very hard as commissioners in charge of the elections to make sure and actually go out of our way to promote getting people who have never voted before to get out and vote. So, you know, that should always be first and foremost. I don't know any elected official that's ever gone out and said, I don't want you to vote. I don't care if you agree with me or not. I want you to vote. I want everyone to vote to make their voice known. Because quite frankly, if you're not voting, I don't want to hear you complaining. I tell people that all the time. But I do want to say for the record, and I think this goes back to what we talked about with the poll worker situation as well in the training. There are a lot of nuances in each and every county that make us different. To Christina's point, you know, she mentioned about slowing down the lines. In my county, it would actually speed up the lines to have a voter ID because most of my poll workers are 75 and older. They have a hard time hearing. They can see well, some of them can see fine, but I'm just being honest. I mean, you know, sometimes it's very difficult for somebody to come in and spell a name and try and get them to look it up in a poll book. Whereas if they have something in front of them that they can look at, it speeds up the process. And that's in my county. It may not be the same in every county, but in my county, I know my county very well. And I know that this would actually help speed up the lines and speed up the process. That may not be the case in everyone's county.
Thanks, Joe. Pat?
Yeah, I just wanted to express the sentiment. I mean, this group has done an excellent job of, you know, staying focused on the policy and fleshing out the nuances and you know, there obviously there are some election issues that are newly fraught and contentious, and there's some that have been around for a little bit longer. This is one that's been around a little bit longer. I guess to put a finer point on what will go into the report, would it be obviously like the Applewhite language coming out, the specific voter ID recommendation that's currently in there coming out, but would we keep in this current paragraph largely as is? I mean, there are a couple of tweaks that were discussed about the first line, and obviously like something could be added about like, you know, if this consensus exists, consensus around continuing to pursue a policy that the board will vote on. But would that be what's on the table to go into the report? I just want to get clarity around
Yeah,
that.
I could see. I don't know that I would say, all right, I would take that first sentence, particularly the part changing it to provide confidence in election integrity, as Ken has suggested, and probably the second sentence where we talk about how disenfranchisement is always important. Yeah, we would clean this up. But basically that's what we're talking about, and explaining why we're making the repeals we do of the Applewhite issues. And again, we would go back and we would clean this up really quick and circulate it back to you sometime next week, just to get a quick yay or nay on how we would rewrite that particular provision. But that's basically it. I think we could also say that that, you know, it's a subject of a lot of debate, and we want to devote more time to it before we propose anything definitive. I can even see kind of going a little more in depth into why people are supporting it and why they're opposing it. But overall, I think, yeah, make the recommendation to pull out the Applewhite language, and then kind of just explain where we stand and where we stand procedurally on the issue and what we're going to do moving forward. I'm not sure who had their hand up first, Joe or Russ. You guys can duke it out.
I'm looking forward to hearing Russ, but I just want to say this, you know, this board is still fairly new. We have the ability we could take this issue completely and throw it aside and not deal with it. But I believe if we do, when we are living in a society where an overwhelming majority of Pennsylvanians, based on what I've seen and heard, are in favor of some kind of voter ID, for us to do that, I think we are taking away any, sorry, my lights just kicked on, any potential for people listening to us, especially the legislature. The legislature are representatives of the people. And if this is an important issue to the people, then it should be an important issue to the legislature. And if we want to have any influence over potential law in the future, then I think it's important that we not just throw this aside completely. To Pat's point, I think we've got to keep it on the agenda. We've got to keep working on it and try and come to some kind of understanding that this is an issue that we do need to speak on, not just throw aside and let it go for another day. Not necessarily today, but we've got to keep working on it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, I think that's where we're coming down. Russ.
So just to clarify, the intent here right now before us is to take care of the Applewhite problem, but save the rest for later.
Yep.
That's the intent.
Very succinctly put. Thank you, Russ.
All right, thank you so much. Just want to be clear.
Yep, nope, that's I use a lot of words to say short things sometimes, but yes, that is what we want to do. Chairman Lawrence, are you comfortable with that as a way to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely we have no consensus here right now. And hopefully I can be heard. Say my connection is unstable, but yes, I think we need to, I think we need to table this. I'm not saying that we put the issue aside. I agree absolutely with what Joe said, but in the time that we have here today, I don't think we're going to come to any kind of consensus on this.
Nope. No, thank you. Yeah, I think we have a good idea how to move forward. So like I said, we'll go back, we'll clean this up, we'll get it back out to you next week. Hopefully you can all say, yep, that's what we said. And then we can get ready to release. Obviously, not so much the federal section, but the section on state legislative proposals is already out of date. There have been more proposals introduced in the last week on election law revisions. So, I mean, we're going to try to make sure everything is as current as humanly possible the day before we go to press. So you may see some revisions as we finalize, but they're not going to be anything of substance beyond what we've approved here today. And Russ.
Yeah, just to clarify, so this portion other than Applewhite, won't be going into the June report.
Correct.
Are we limited in waiting till next June? Or can we do a supplemental report to the General Assembly as well? And
I think Wendy left, so she's not going to kill me. Yeah, we can do supplemental reports.
Okay.
If we want.
okay, good enough.
Promised House State Government that we would do a supplemental report on mail-in ballots when we get a decision from the Supremes. So yeah, we can do it. Wendy will probably, beat me up when she's back online, but yes, it absolutely can be done. And no, we are required to produce an annual report. If we come up with brilliant ideas between now and then, and we want to get it across the street to the General Assembly, and I say that because most of you have not been here in our offices. We're in the finance building and we are literally across the street from the Capitol. So that's kind of mentally how we view things happening here. But yeah, that, and if we come up with something and we're satisfied with it and it's October, then we'll write it up, we'll submit it, and we'll send it across. So, and really the annual report is as much where we stand on any given time than necessarily saving all the new ideas for then. So I hope that answers those questions. Okay, well that was, I feel like I ran a marathon. Of course, walking across my office makes me feel like I'm running a marathon, so I'm not so sure how significant that is. So, okay, next question then. Are there parts of the narrative that people have substantive problems with? I know there are some places where we have some typos, where we have some word choice issues that we need to clean up a little bit, but overall, the remaining sections of the report, are there concerns? Are there things that you think we got wrong that you want to point out to us that we can go back and look at? What we tried to do is take the products of the work groups and refine them, update them, and organize them in a way to present what the board's been doing all year. So if you got something, share it with us, please.
I guess I have a minor point that may be applicable to this discussion we just had. In the voter registration section in the first paragraph, there's a mention about the same day voter registration, automatic voter registration, pre-registration for folks under 18, and how at the last meeting, I think the quick consensus was like, those are also issues like we're not gonna get agreement on right away probably for a number of different reasons. So there's a sentence that suggests the same day and automatic voter reg were not advanced, which is completely 100% accurate. The second sentence says that pre-registration of persons under age 18 was also rejected. I think my suggestion is to soften that, because I'm not sure if we rejected as much as we tabled it. Just like today, we're not rejecting voter ID. We're holding off on it until we can come back to a consensus agreement on it. And I suspect that may come up a bunch of times, and I'm not sure when, if ever, we want to fully reject something versus just like we just couldn't get consensus on it. Maybe we will next time, the next year, the year after that. So yeah, that's the one point I'll make, which may be applicable to other items we have.
And Randall had a correction for that section as well that he had emailed us. So that's something we're going to tinker with a little bit to make sure it's clear and accurate. So yeah, thank you. Okay. Anybody else? No. Well, then the semi-last vote, the last vote for today anyway, is with the changes that we've approved and with the caveat that the recommendation on voter ID will be sent out separately just to verify that everybody is in agreement on that. We'd like to get a vote to authorize the release of this report next month. I don't have an exact date for you yet, but next month. So with those exceptions, can we get a vote on approving the report conditionally, at least for release? Okay, not unanimity, but a good size majority. Okay, I can live with that. Thank you all very, very much. At this point, I got nothing more. Ken, Joe, anybody else have anything they want to add for the good of the order? Are you voting, Christina, or do you want to talk?
I just have one thing I want to say. I'd like to eventually really kind of do a deep dive into poll workers. I know we did that a little bit, but I heard some things about some counties using split shifts and other counties not. I'd love to see some changes there. I know I'm constantly beating this horse, but I really think that elected officials are a bad call. I would love to see counties be able to appoint. I think that the thing that we fail to see when people are elected is that there is no litmus test for someone's ability to be able to do the tasks that they are elected to do. It can be problematic, and we have those issues across the state. We of course train and train and train, but it is very important to be mindful of the fact that counties need to do what they need to do to staff. In fact, if it seems like some counties are doing split shifts because they need to, well, then maybe all counties should be able to do split shifts. That would be a wonderful thing. It would certainly help in Delaware County and Philadelphia if we were able to do the same things that they're doing in rural counties, because we were understaffed in this most recent election. And that was simply because we ensure that people are working all day per the letter of the law. So I think it's important to maybe do a deep dive on this at a later date. And I also want to commend you, Yvonne. The report is very well written. And in the poll worker section, it also really states the disinformation and the impact that is having on poll worker staffing. And I really appreciate that. And I think it should be highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, who wrote that chapter principally. Of course, being the control freak that I am, I added everything, but it is definitely Steve's work. So appreciate that. And I do, I think we do need to come back to that. My understanding was that there were a lot of new judges of election who were elected in November, who then found out what all they and declined, and the counties had to end up appointing people to do those jobs anyway, because those newly elected people were not prepared for what they were getting into. And when they learned what they were getting into, they said, not me. So I think that is an issue we need to go for. Dan and Ken then.
Thank you, Yvonne. I'm very much enjoying being a member of this board. I've learned a lot, today being no exception. I truly hope, though, that at some point we can sit down face to face as a group. And I say that being the guy that would have the longest drive, because I'm very close to the Ohio line, and it's about a 4.5-hour drive for me to get to Harrisburg. And I realize Zoom is convenient. It does save time. It saves travel time. But I truly hope that we can meet in person going forward. Maybe not every time, but perhaps every other time. I just think it would I don't know, we'd all get to know one another a little bit better, I think, that way. So I'll just throw that out as a request. Thank you.
Well, and in response to that, Dan, if we, I would, obviously we got to figure out logistics here and everything else, but especially with the voter ID, I would like to see us meet in person, because if we meet in person, we can meet for 4 or 5 hours and really get into things and nail things down. With the Zoom meetings or Teams meetings or whatever, you're more time limited. And so for something like the voter ID, I really would like to see us be in person, because I think it would give us the ability to get in a really deep dive and really have conversations and not have such time constraints. So we'll go back, we'll talk about logistically how we can work that out. But I would like to see, when we do voter ID, that we've got a good solid 4 hours plus of sitting around the table and trying to nail this down. Ken.
Dan and Yvonne, you completely stole what I was going to say. Yeah, we've talked about an in-person meeting, particularly on voter ID, where I think we have had some cross things here. I think it needs to be an in-person meeting. And I'm also not for meetings, so if it can't be in person, I don't, so if we can poll and see where people are on that, but I think it's definitely time for an in-person meeting. And I think on an issue like voter ID, we're more than 40 minutes or so. We really need to be able to sit down and talk about it. So thank you, Dan.
Yep. Okay, Joe.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I appreciate Dan's comments. I think we've all learned a lot so far, and Pat and I probably disagree on a lot of things, but I've really come to respect him, and I can't wait to hear about the baby when we get to meet in person. But just on a general sense, I just want to wish everybody a happy Memorial Day. Hope you guys all have a safe weekend, and just be careful out there. It's interesting times we're living in.
Speaking of which, Pat, do we know a gender and name for this child? Would you care to share?
little boy Dawkins. Little boy
Nice.
Dawkins Christmas, who's joined Piper. Christmas. Piper's almost 4 now, and so
okay.
Piper's adjusting pretty well.
Yeah.
And we're a little sleep deprived here, but not nearly as much as the election director. So I was not going to complain about that.
Absolutely. Lisa.
Thank you. I need to jump off. I just wanted to also congratulate Pat and really just thank everybody for a really thoughtful discussion, and I appreciate it. And have a very good Memorial Day weekend.
Great. Thank you. Well, at this point then, I'm going to say thank you, everybody. We as staff really appreciate the level of civility and maturity that these conversations and these discussions have. Everybody has a viewpoint, and they're sharing and they're listening, and that makes our job a lot easier. Negotiating our way through these meetings and coming up with recommendations and things like that. So, and did anybody notice I'm taller today? I got a higher seating chair, so I don't have to have my face half cut in half on the screen. Anyway, so thank you all very, very much. This was very productive and very informative. I think we know where we're going, and hopefully you'll all feel good about it when it comes out. And we'll be in touch about meeting some more, because we have a whole lot on our plates that we still need to deal with. But I think we've made some good progress, and we've done some of the stuff that our statute asks us to do, which is start cleaning up the election code. And so I feel like we're at a minimum that. Anyway, thank you. We appreciate the feedback. This has really been a team collaboration. Steve and Grant and I are having some interesting conversations. Yesterday, we had a chat about the recount. So we're waiting as anxiously as everybody else to see how that all falls out. And Jonathan, we wish you luck. Your next couple of weeks probably aren't going to be any quieter than the last two have been.
Yeah, I'm not alone. All 67 counties are going to be feeling it too. So
Yes. So anyway, I think I've said thank you about 6 different ways. So if you're all happy, we're happy, and we're going to move forward. And thanks again. Have a good holiday weekend and take care. And we'll be with you soon enough.
Bye, everyone.